Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Bernie ISD trustee and owner of the Bernie Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Bernie City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros. Ready, aim, ceasefire.
Good morning. Welcome to Ceasefire. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And I hope everybody is having a wonderful Independence Day weekend. I had a great time yesterday. I hope you did too, Ron.
Absolutely.
Great. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, this should be interesting. Independence Day, we're going to talk about something that a lot of us hear about, the idea of separation of church and state, but we're going to talk about it in terms of public schools, or charter schools, I should say. So there was a case back in May of this year, not too long back, and this was Oklahoma Statewide Charter School Board et al. Petitioners versus Gentner Drummond, Attorney General of Oklahoma. And this one all the way to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So in June 2023, the Oklahoma Statewide Virtual Charter School Board approved a contract request from the St. Isidor of Seville Catholic Virtual School of Oklahoma City. I didn't know that there were Catholic virtual schools, but apparently there are. So the school agreed that it would be free and open to all students like a traditional public school, and it would comply with all local, state, and federal education laws. But they also said that they would fully embrace the teachings of the Catholic Church and its evangelizing mission. Now, the Oklahoma Attorney General, this guy by the name of Gentner Drummond, he says, he sues to block the approval of the school state charter, calling it, quote, an unlawful sponsorship, end quote, of a sectarian institution.
So he sued the state.
Yes.
As Attorney General for the state.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and he calls it a quote again, serious threat to the religious liberty of 4 million Oklahomans, end quote. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and tell you something about Mr. Drummond. Just sharing this with the general audience right now, I would ask them if I could, is Mr. Drummond a Democrat or a Republican? And I think that most people would say that he's a Democrat, and most people would be wrong. He's a Republican. And this is interesting. I think we'll circle back to that later. Good question. Why would a Republican be against this, or why should they be? Now, this goes to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and they blocked the funding, stating that using the public funds for a religious school was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And then this case was appealed to the Supreme Court, which agreed to take on the case. Now, Justice Barrett, she recused herself from the case, so we've got 8 justices now. And ultimately, on May 22nd of this year, they split 4-4, and so the appeal failed. And I've got here in my chocolate chip covered and stained fingers the ruling from the Supreme Court, and it's one page, and it's very unusual. It basically just states, who the people involved in this fight, and it just says it's affirmed by an equally divided court. Or in other words, it's, the appeal fails. Mm-hmm. And it mentions that Justice Barrett took no part in the consideration or decision of these cases. And it doesn't tell you how the votes came down per justice.
That is interesting. How often does that ever happen? I don't think I've ever heard of that before.
I don't know. And here's what I think, again, like I said with the Attorney General, most people would assume he's a Democrat. I think most of us would assume that the 3 liberal justices were in favor of not doing the appeal, right? And my guess would be Justice Roberts joined them, right? But we don't know that.
Right.
I can't prove that. There's nothing, and then I searched, and there's nothing there that tells you one way or another.
People can suppose probably which way the votes went. Why would they want to hide that? I don't know. That just seems odd because there's lots of other very controversial votes that every name is on one side or the other.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Well, and this might be where we need an expert like we had with when we had Catherine in here a few weeks ago. Yeah. It may be the case that on a split decision they don't mess with that. I don't know. I have no idea.
Maybe so. But it all brings to the fore this issue of what is separation of church and state.
Right.
How far should it go?
Yeah, and the question of is it proper? If we tried to do that in Texas, would it be proper for the state of Texas to fund a sectarian charter school?
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing, though, is with the recently passed voucher program, in Texas, what they're doing is they're giving the money to the parents, and then the parents decide what school it goes to. So the state doesn't actually have any direct connection with the school that receives the funding. Mm-hmm. Now, we do have charter schools, but that's a whole separate, different program. So technically, the state is separated from the church by the parents.
Right.
In that case.
So let's go back to the question I asked earlier. Why would a Republican not want to support this?
Well, there's two things. The first thing that pops into my mind is Oklahoma is a red state. And in any state that's dominated by one party or the other, everybody that wants to be anybody is part of that party, regardless of which way they feel about things. We see that in Bernie. Most people in Bernie say that they're Republican regardless of which way they feel about things.
Right.
And I think that happens there too. So I don't know this guy. I don't know anything about him. I haven't done any research on him. So that's my first thought. The second thought is that he sees it as a slippery slope. That, yes, he might not mind funding a Catholic school, but maybe he wouldn't want to fund a Wiccan school or something else. So maybe he just wants to keep the state out of that as much as possible, regardless of the constitutionality of it, which I don't necessarily agree with him on.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of how I was thinking. When I read this article, I first shared it with my wife, and she thought, well, why would you want that? And raised a great question. She said, well, what if they were teaching something else? Mm-hmm. What if it was an Islamic charter school? And nothing wrong with that, right? But if you're a Christian, are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with them evangelizing?
But either one of them gets to the point is, why is the government having any say in what religion's going on in a school? And this brings up the issue of strings attached to money.
Right.
Anytime somebody gives money to something, whether it's the government or a person, they're going to have strings on that money.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, I think Harvard's finding this out now, in that they've been accommodating to the strings that they sort of like coming from the government on what to research and what positions to take in their schooling. And now they've got somebody that's giving them money that has a different set of strings and doesn't want them to do certain things. And they have a big problem with that.
Right.
So anytime you set up a system where one entity is giving another entity money, you're going to have strings. And those strings can turn into cables and tie you down. And some of these big schools may end up finding themselves in desperate situations because of these cables that they've enjoyed so far and considered supports.
Right. Are
now not good.
Harvard's a great example. Let's talk about another example.
Which used to be a religious school.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So let's talk about another example, bringing it down to the high school and middle school and elementary level. You'll recall during COVID that there were public school shutdowns across the nation. Did you know that over 90% of most Catholic schools did not shut down?
Yes, and they didn't see the drop in the performance.
No, they did not. Right. And now I find it interesting that there's a Catholic school that wants to take money from the federal government. And as you pointed out, or in this case, the state government, as you pointed out, that comes with strings.
Yeah.
And we don't think about that. I think oftentimes as Christians, we're thinking about the end goal. For example, you don't have to spend too much time on social media, and you'll see the woe is the world, oh my gosh, things are terrible. Things were better in the old days. And there's this argument that when we had God in school, kids were better. When we had God in school, the country was better. When we had God in school, we weren't in this cesspool that we're living in now, right? So the argument is that when we took prayer out of school, everything just went downhill. I would argue that if you go back and you look at census data, that you've seen this historical decline in church membership, in church attendance, in people's views of their own faith, how many people identify as Christians. That number keeps dwindling every year. In the latest Pew Research poll for 2025, it's stabilized a little bit. And it's almost become political, too, because liberals are less likely to identify now as having religion or being religious than conservatives, whereas in the past that wasn't the case.
I think that's even changing a little bit, because as we move from liberal and conservatives to left-wing and right-wing, I think there's less religious connotations in that, because there's a lot of right-wingers that are not religious.
Right.
And so I think that may be fraying a little bit as our extremes change their appearances.
Right. In any case, I think it's too simplistic to say that it was the removal of prayer in school. I don't think it was that was just one single event. That was one thing, but I think that ultimately that got us where we really needed to be anyway, because there was always a danger. As long as we were promoting a certain faith in a school, there was always a danger of somebody being able to come in and say, based on the laws of our country, well, now I want you to promote my faith.
Yeah.
It was a better idea, I think, to take that out and say, let the parents deal with that, because ultimately, who is responsible for instilling faith in your children?
The parents. But I think the interest also is, there's an interest in society to have moral people. And so much of a person's morality supposedly comes from the parents, but it also comes from their social groups. And the social groups are in school. And so I think there is value in having a moral structure in schools. Mm-hmm. Now, where do morals come from? I mean, some people think they just pop out of thin air, that we make them up for ourselves, but honestly, they're taught. And generally, the structure of that teaching somewhere along the line comes from some religion or some belief in a higher power, regardless of which religion it is. It's something believing that there's more important things in the physical world. And that's sort of where the morals come from. And so I do believe that there is value in having that moral structure within all of our institutions. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is, we read a book a long time ago called The 5,000-Year Leap, and I think in there they talked about the forefathers believed in religious freedom, and that's why they put the First Amendment in there. But they also believed in a religious society, and they wanted their schools, they all had, a lot of them were involved with schools of their time. They felt that people should be educated in a religious manner, but they made an interesting comment about it. They thought that the religion should be taught should be anything that's not objectionable to any religion. And that cuts out a lot of church dogma or specific beliefs. And it gets down to almost the most fundamental basics of religion, which is a belief in a higher power. That's pretty much it.
Right.
And I don't see a problem with that being taught in a school, because you can take that anywhere. And if you limit it to just to that, then if you're worried about the Wiccans or the Catholics or the Muslims, then you can say, well, they can only talk about there being a higher power in their school.
Right.
So I think we haven't looked at the nuances of what we're teaching enough, and we've just sort of done this church and state to try and drive out church and fundamentally morality from our institutions, I think, a lot.
Interesting.
That's a bit of a ramble there, but
no,
I hope it sort of came across.
It was cohesive.
Was it? Okay.
It was. And you do all of that without coffee. That's impressive.
Yeah.
I'd need like 7 cups in the morning to get that out.
It's not the crack of dawn.
So I'm struggling here. I understand what you're saying, mm-hmm. and I don't disagree with it. And yet I still have this apprehension about somebody else other than me teaching the basics.
Then you should homeschool.
Well, fortunately, I'm past that age now.
Yeah, no, me too. And honestly, I did consider it growing up, but I just didn't think I could handle it. I admire homeschoolers to no end, and I didn't do it just because I felt I would go nuts.
Well, I didn't do it because, at the time when they entered school, Kat and I were both working. Mm-hmm. And we liked the school system here.
Yeah.
We thought it was a good school system, but I did find some things objectionable when I can't remember what year it was, but when my daughter was a champion, I remember she came home one day and she had watched the Al Gore movie. I'm forgetting the name of it.
An Inconvenient Truth.
An Inconvenient Truth,
yeah.
Right. And I said, well, okay, that's fine, but did you watch anything to counter that? Was there another movie that they showed you that talked about why that might not be true? And she said, no. I let that go. And then she came back later that semester and she watched Super Size Me, and now I was mad because
you like your burgers.
Well, not just that, but it's like, are they teaching anything, or are you just watching movies?
Yeah,
not that I complained when I was in school and I got to watch a movie. I was happy about that, but now that it's my daughter, it's like, hey,
get to work.
Get to work, right? But there was a movie, and I don't remember the name of it. It came out shortly after Super Size Me, and it was I think it was a man that did the film, and it was the same concept as Super Size Me. He ate at McDonald's for 30 days straight, but he made different choices. on the menu, and he lost weight, and he lowered his blood pressure and lowered his A1C, right? Everything turned out well for him. And so the point of his film was that it's personal choice. And who among us anyway goes and eats McDonald's 3 meals a day for 30 days straight? That's not realistic, right?
Yeah.
And so I asked her, well, did they show you this other film? And she said no. And so I made an appointment to go see the assistant vice principal. I shared my concerns with him. I knew they weren't going to go anywhere. I hate saying that because, again, I do like the school district. I support the school district, but it went nowhere. And then a year later, my son's in the same grade, in the same classes, watching the same 2 movies. And it was very, very frustrating for me because I wanted them to have a true, well-balanced education. But it was then imperative for me to go and talk to my children about alternative ideas.
Yeah.
You know, there's Al Gore's movie, that's great, but let's talk about this, you know, and here's the supersized film, but let's talk about this.
This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll get back and talk about some schools some more. Bernie has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Bernie Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Bernie Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you are looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Bernie Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Bernie at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Bernie Bookshop. Welcome back to Ceasefire, brought to you by the Bernie Bookshop with Dale and Ron. We're talking about schools and religious education, and we sort of devolved into just general education, sort of the biases that might be inherent in some educational systems. I do think it's incumbent upon parents to realize that every school, every teacher, every person has biases. And if we want to have our teachers to have the freedom to teach, we have to give them some flexibility in how they teach. We can give guidelines, we can ask for different perspectives, but we also need to recognize that kids are going to go out there and they're going to see people that say a point of view, and they may not see the other side. And it is incumbent upon parents to keep an eye on things and provide that other view, or to ask the teacher or the administration if they feel that there's too limiting number of point of views in the school, to broaden those a little bit.
Something else comes to mind too. I have been reading political stuff since I don't know when. I subscribe to National Review and other similar publications, and I've been fascinated by that topic for a long time, about government and history and political science. My children, not so much. And a main interest to me as they were growing up was to make sure that there were some fundamental things that were taught to them, you know, some fundamental rights and wrongs, and some understanding of their background, you know, who their grandparents were, their great-grandparents, where they came from, religious beliefs. But I never really thought about An Inconvenient Truth. I never thought about that movie. I never thought to talk to my children about climate change or the separation of church and state. Like, those things just didn't occur to me. And so the benefit to having those ideas presented to them, even though it bothered me that there wasn't an alternative presented to them, the benefit of those ideas presented is that my children came home and talked to me about it.
Which is a good thing that they did.
Right. And it gave me an opportunity then to stand on a soapbox and say, well, look, here are some other ideas. And I wouldn't have had that. It would never have occurred to me to talk to them about the dangers of eating McDonald's 3 times a day for 30 days in a row. Because who does that, right?
Yeah,
but to talk about making the right choices when it comes to diet and exercise, I didn't think about those things. And so somebody deciding to show that movie to my kids in high school gave me a platform.
I hate to say this, but I suspect that you were probably one of the few parents that heard about that and had a discussion about it the way you did.
Maybe
I suspect
so.
A lot of kids didn't tell their parents, or they did, and the parents said, oh, okay, and didn't think anything else about it.
And I might have been the only parent going into the school to talk to the assistant vice principal about those 2 films, and I'm sure he was thinking, how did I land this one? Where's this guy coming from? What's he upset about?
I'm going to interject my story on that here. And I hope I don't make anybody mad about this, but my kids went to Bernie High, and they came home. They didn't see that movie, either one of those actually. They came home with a book entitled Fire, Ice, and Paradise, which is written by a local, I don't remember who he was. This is a long time ago. But it's the counter that you were looking for. It was a book written, I think he was a geologist or something like that. And he wrote about the impacts of carbon dioxide on plant growth and basically broke down a whole lot of the climate dogma and showed his perspective that it was all nonsense. And so it was interesting. It was interesting that they presented that. So that gave us a talking opportunity too. But I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Right now.
There are.
Right now.
Okay, I hope no heads are exploding.
There are a lot of Greyhound parents that are feeling justified. And like, see, we told you that was a better high school.
They're both great high schools. They are. I don't know if you saw the recent, couple months ago, Dorman Vick was on the cover of Kennel Gentleman. Awesome article. It was great.
Yeah.
But they're both great high schools.
They are. We were just talking about them last night. A group of us were getting together, and I don't even know how the subject came up, but we were talking about our experiences driving down 46 at school time when school's letting out.
Terrible.
And I remember when my kids were going there, I would sit and I'd watch the cars going in or coming out, depending on the time of day, and they were cars comparable in cost to my own. I'm like, who lets high schoolers drive cars like these, you know? I guess it has a little bit of a reputation. And then last year we had a foreign exchange student, Lorianne, living with us. And so I would take her to Champion. And as I was pulling out of the school and I'd wait at that light on Charger Boulevard to turn on 46, and I'd watch the cars coming in, the students in their Mercedes and BMWs and Jaguars. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like high school is very different from what it was. And this town is very different.
Yeah.
Different subject here.
Very
I'm
prosperous.
sorry.
We're a prosperous community. And, and, you know, we can look at that and say, oh, that shouldn't be that way. But, you know, it indicates how prosperous we are. And prosperity is good.
Yeah.
You know, so more power to them, I guess. It's the attitude that you raise in your children that's important, not necessarily the financial surroundings.
Right. Well, now we're on a different subject, but I agree with you. Prosperity is good. The challenge is to keep your children grounded when they have an abundance. And like in my case, I love to remind them that their grandmother, my mom, coming from Cuba, was not able to complete her high school education. And, you know, she talked about going to school with no shoes, you know, when she was in Cuba, and just making them understand that they do have or enjoy a privilege that other people do not have, and, you know, stay grounded.
Interesting thing about that is prosperity is great. Everybody wants it. We're all striving for it. But prosperity in and of itself doesn't actually teach anything.
Right.
Hardship teaches a lot.
Yeah.
So as a parent, if you want your kids to have a prosperous upbringing, then that teaching needs to be coming from somewhere else.
Yeah.
You know, because the hardship in and of itself teaches a lot of things. Prosperity doesn't really teach much.
I'm going to tie all this together and come back full circle. And since we're talking about hardship, then what better than one of those sisters from the Blues Brothers cracking your knuckles with a stick, you know?
That's some hardship. And
that's a great learning environment right there.
It is.
You
yes.
Yeah.
But that conflicts with our desire to protect our children, too. Okay, getting back to religion in schools. I've got a book here, and I looked around. There's a lot of different books on religion and raising your kids in a religious way, and I was frantically looking for some this morning, but this is one I found. It's not really religious, but it's called The Spiritual Child, and it's the new science of parenting for health and lifelong thriving. And it's an interesting book because it brings up the issue of how do you raise a child that's spiritual. Now, it's not a religious book, but it is spiritual. It's kind of neat. We got it at the Bernie Bookshop. I think all this issue of separation of church and state in schools, it behooves us to think how involved we want our government in the schools.
Right.
Because if we want to have all these restrictions on government because we have all these various rights and stuff like that, then maybe it shouldn't be involved in certain areas. Like we don't have government-run churches because the restrictions conflict with that. We don't have government-run families. We don't have government-run dinners because we want to say grace. Maybe government-run schools are not the best model. honestly, I do believe in universal funding for schools because some kids that can't have the funding for whatever kind of school that is best for them. But the more disconnect you can put between the government and the actual school, I think is probably a good idea.
I concur.
Okay, we're going to wrap up this Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys have a nice day and a nice Independence Day weekend. And if you missed any of this, you can always go to BernieRadio.com and listen to our podcast. And we will see you next week.